You are listening to KZSC's Voces, Criticas, Critical Voices. I am your host, Silvana Falcone. Today, I have live in the studio with me Professor Stephen McKay and Hermes Padilla. Stephen McKay is an associate professor of sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the director of the UC Santa Cruz Center for Labor Studies. His research interests include labor and labor markets, globalization, migration, race, gender, and Southeast Asia. He's the author of Satanic Mills or Silicon Islands, The Politics of High-Tech Production in the Philippines, published in 2006, and is the co-principal investigator of No Place Like Home, the Affordable Housing Crisis Study of Santa Cruz County, a comprehensive study of renter experiences and housing conditions in Santa Cruz County. Hermes Padilla is a community studies and politics Latin American and Latino studies double major. Before arriving to UC Santa Cruz, he worked towards higher education attainment for Latinx youth by being an active participant of Voces, an organization that advocated, fundraised, and provided legal assistance to DACA and AB 540 students. He also helped pioneer an educational assistance program for first-generation Latinx students called Estudiantes Unidos at Glendale College. After arriving to UC Santa Cruz, he got involved with the No Place Like Home project under the direction of Professor Stephen McKay and Professor Miriam Greenberg in the sociology department. His research interests include housing policies, displacement, and urban issues within the Latinx community. They're here to talk about an exciting event happening next week, Thursday, October 19th at 7 p.m. at the Civic Auditorium in downtown Santa Cruz, called No Place Like Home. No Place Like Home is a campus community event to unveil the findings of a county-wide research on the affordable housing crisis here in Santa Cruz. They conducted over 1,400 surveys and interviews with local residents about how they are experiencing the local housing crisis. The event will also feature a visual and literary art exhibit on the meaning of quote-unquote home and is a kickoff event to Affordable Housing Week with a wide range of county organizations and community groups participating in an open discussion of responses to the crisis and sharing information about strategies, campaigns, and upcoming events seeking a way forward. Welcome to KZSC's Voces Criticas, Stephen and Hermes. Stephen, let's start with you. How did No Place Like Home as a research project and now this report come to be? And why do you think it was so important to intentionally engage such a wide range of community groups for this project?
Well, the project really came out of previous research that we did with community partners. So we worked very closely with the California Rural Legal Assistance and the Community Action Board of Santa Cruz County. And in our previous research, it focused on low-wage workers. And so that project was to look at how are low-wage workers experiencing the work that they have to do, particularly in the service sector. And a big puzzle that came out of that research were that residents and workers were making an average of $10 an hour. And we were just wondering, how in the world are they getting by in Santa Cruz at such low wages? And the number one issue that when we interviewed and talked to workers was really the high cost and the precarious conditions of housing. So our animating research question for this project was the question, how do people create a sense of home despite the affordable housing crisis?
Hermes,
yes.
How did you become involved in this research project? And what was the experience like for you as a student to have such an applied research experience as part of your undergraduate studies?
So I first got involved with the research project through the SOCH 139T Community Research Practicum course. And with that course, I went out into the field and conducted surveys. And over time, I just became more and more involved with the project. And for me, it was actually a really good experience to have, to be able to apply what I've learned in the classrooms out in the field. And not only that, but it actually let me understand really what research was actually about by engaging with the community.
I mean, isn't that the best kind of sociology, Steve? Actually learning, taking what we try and teach them in class and actually taking it out to the field?
Yeah, and it's been energizing me as a teacher because we see the students just come alive, taking the issues that we begin to talk about in the class, and then we go out in the field. And I think one of my favorite parts of the research was after we would survey for several hours from about 6 to 8 or 8:30, we would reconvene at one of the community resource centers and have a meal and just talk about how it went. And it was that engagement after having read Evicted by Matthew Desmond and then going out and talking to people about their housing conditions, the students could really put the two together. It gave them a new way to approach the scholarship, but they saw themselves as producers of knowledge in a way that I think their classroom experience doesn't allow.
Right, the classroom alone can only do so much. So, Steve, tell us about No Place Like Home in relationship to the other multi-year project that you were engaged in called Working for Dignity. In terms of the kind of overall research agenda, why did you want to think about work and home together? Is it about the same communities are being affected in terms of labor and the housing crisis that you are going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, they're really organically connected because your biggest expense is usually your housing. And it's also the element of our basic needs that's least likely to be subsidized. And so when we started looking at the deep connections between home and work, particularly at the low end of the labor market, nearly all workers are renters. Few of them own their own homes, so they have the least control over their housing conditions. So in our previous research, when we interviewed about 1,300 workers, almost all of them were renters, and we know that, and that sample made only $10 an hour. But when we look at all renters in Santa Cruz County, their median hourly wage is just $14 an hour, right? So what it told us was that people really are barely getting by, and at the same time, we have the least affordable housing market in the entire country. Not even just in expensive California, but in the entire country. We're not the most expensive city, but if you compare the average wages that people earn in Santa Cruz with how much the housing costs, it's the least affordable.
That's a little depressing. So, Hermes, did you have a particular experience when you were doing this research that maybe has stayed with you? Is there an incident or any kind of stories that you would like to share about what made this research so meaningful for you?
So there was actually this one lady that I interviewed in Watsonville that really made a huge impact on me, and it really made me understand why I need to go out in the community and engage with them when it comes to research. And it was mostly because she was living in her house for 26 years, the same house. She's been a renter the whole entire time, and she was currently about to be evicted because the prices were going up. She wasn't able to afford it. She even started renting the rooms out in order to compensate for the prices going up, and it just wasn't working out. And this lady was actually known completely in the whole entire street. Everybody knew who she was, and she's helped a lot of the kids in that street grow up. And it just showed me that getting rid of someone like that could really make a huge impact in the community, and it literally is because of the housing crisis that she was being displaced.
And so it was a matter that she couldn't no longer afford the rent. Was it going up every year?
Yeah, the rent was going up every year, and it was the last year it actually went up $500. So it was a huge difference.
So is there no rent control at all in this county?
No, unfortunately, there are some in mobile home parks. They have some, but those have been challenged. Rent control laws have been challenged and rolled back, so there's no rent control currently in Santa Cruz.
So in a case like the story that Hermes just shared with us, is there any legal recourse or anything that a renter in that situation can do?
Not really. So there's no limit on the amount that a landlord can raise the rent. We've even heard of rent auctions where a landlord will have people who want to look at a place, they'll have them come all at the same time, and then they will ask, okay, well, we know this is going to go more than the asking price, so how much are you willing to pay?
That's crazy.
Yes.
And so this is some of the stories that you'd be hearing in the research.
Yes. So one of the things we focused on is rent burden. So the percentage of your income that you're spending on rent and utilities. And by federal standards, which was set in the 1930s, that really you shouldn't spend more than a third of your income on rent because you need to eat, you need to buy clothes, you need to educate your kids. So that's a reasonable amount. So anything above spending more than 30% of your income on rent is considered rent burden. So in our going around, we asked people how much they were spending on rent and how much their household income was. Well, we found nearly 70% of people that we talked to, and we actually talked to 1,700 people, that they were spending, 70% of them were spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And so then there's another category. It's called extreme rent burden. And that extreme rent burden is 50% of your income. 41% of the people we spoke with spent half their income on rent. And then there's a category that's not even a statistical category, is 70%. We asked people how much, and 26% of the people we talked to spend more than 70% of their income on rent. And so you can imagine that, how are they able to do that? And why? Well, again, because there are very few subsidies and people have to stay and they don't have any choice, right, to do it. And so that often is what gets paid before anything else. And as one researcher put it, some days children go hungry because the rent eats first.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's not as if like, let me just go to Watsonville or let me just go to San Jose and I won't have a housing problem there. There's different kinds of crises going on there. You were listening to Stephen McKay, Associate Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the Director of the UC Center for Labor Studies. He is a co-principal investigator of No Place Like Home, the Affordable Housing Crisis Study of Santa Cruz County, a comprehensive study of renters, renter experiences, and housing conditions. You are also listening to Hermes Padilla, a community studies and politics and Latin American and Latino studies double major, who was one of the undergraduate student researchers who was part of the No Place Like Home team. Hermes, tell me about what aspects of the research did you contribute to? The interviews, the surveys, both?
I started off with surveys, and as I got more involved, I actually did help people conduct interviews in Spanish, and I as well started getting into the data. And so that's kind of what I've been focusing on, and it's been a good opportunity for me, definitely.
So you could see why these kinds of methods were what needed to be used to tell the stories that you are clearly telling through this study.
Yes.
And so can you tell us from a student perspective, talk about the crisis? We want to, I think, a little bit disentangle the levels of the crisis. And so from a student perspective, what does the crisis look like for students?
As a student that was looking for housing off campus, one thing I've noticed that the people that I've surveyed and talked to that experienced the same thing as me was definitely the lack of availability. But not only that, but as specifically to students, problems with this housing crisis is that students are being discriminated against by some of the landlords. A lot of the landlords are saying that we shouldn't have co-signers, and by saying that, it's pretty much saying no students because a lot of students do not have credit. And it's just something that I've definitely experienced myself when I went out to look, and when I spoke to a lot of students when I was surveying, they've definitely experienced the same. And it's caused a lot of overcrowding. It's caused a lot of rent burden on a lot of people. Some people are having to pay too much for their rent, and some people are having to live in really crowded conditions in order to even find a place to live because there isn't a lot of availability. And
so when you say no co-signers, is that meaning so that people understand like a parent couldn't sign or a guardian could not sign with the student?
Exactly, yes.
And so were you finding, as you were looking for housing yourself, differences between maybe the challenges on the west side versus other parts of the county? Or would you say this was sort of something you heard across the board?
This is something that definitely happened across the whole entire board. But I would say that it definitely showed up more on the east side, I would say. I don't know, the east side tends to be more of a locals area, and they don't tend to like the students as much, at least what I've gotten from the experience. And they definitely tend to have no cosigner, I guess, like policies, versus the west side that kind of tends to take advantage of students a lot of the time.
And then for Steve, in terms of this housing crisis and trying to unpack it a little bit, the tiers and the levels of the crisis, what were some of the concerns for working families? What did you hear in terms of the crisis and how that looks like for the families who are part of the study?
So we surveyed all kinds of people in different households, and about 35% of our sample were households with children. That differed by the different areas. So, for example, only about 14% of those we surveyed on the west side had kids, whereas in Watsonville, 60% of them did. So there's a big variation across the county. But we did find that they were even worse off often than renters as a whole. So, for example, in rent burden, while, again, nearly 70% faced rent burden, those with children, 75% of families with children faced a rent burden, so spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And one of the big things that we found was high levels of overcrowding. So it's overcrowding if you have people either sleeping in non-bedrooms or you have more than 2 people per bedroom. That's considered overcrowding. And the official statistics say that in Santa Cruz, we only about sometimes 4, maybe 6% of people live in overcrowded conditions. But in our sample, we found a much higher rate. 27% of the people we talked to were living in overcrowded conditions. But that was even higher for families. So for families, 38% of those with kids had people sleeping in the living room, or it was incredible. We asked people, if they're not staying in the bedroom, where are they? So they said, the kitchen, sleeping on the porch, in a car in the driveway, in a closet, in a pool shed. So we saw this high level, and we know that is an enormous impact on kids, right? Because they don't have space to do homework. They don't have any room to even think when it's that crowded. So we've heard from the teachers and several principals of schools where they've seen both overcrowding and housing precariousness have a real impact on kids because they're having to move to new schools or they're not able to have a home life that's really fosters their kind of development.
And in terms of the types of abuse that they're experiencing, in terms of like landlord abuse, we sort of hinted a little bit about that. Is that something that kept coming up? I'd be curious about the types of abuse that are also happening vis-a-vis the landlords.
Well, so we asked people kind of, have you experienced any major problems? And some of those are actual violations. Others, like a rent increase, that's not illegal, right? So it's not actually a violation when the landlord raises your rent $500. So we talked in terms of asking people, what are the problems you experience? And so we had a long list of possible violations or experiences they had. And what we found when we asked this, that in terms of experiencing major problems, 57%, so more than half of the people we talked to, had at least one major problem, if not more. And the top problems that people had were increasing rents, but also building maintenance, and then landlords not sort of being responsive for the condition of the building or maintenance. So that was a big one. Now, one of the things we did after we asked, because you had that, did you report it? And less than half of the people ever report any of their major problems. Again, some, like, we asked why, and they're like, well, the rent went up. Who am I going to complain to? It's not illegal. But for others, there was a real fear. Because they're like, well, I could be kicked out at any time. And if I start complaining and need, my sink fixed or my toilet fixed or we have mold, we don't want to complain because we don't want to risk being evicted.
And Hermes, were you hearing the same thing with students in terms of being willing to put up with a lot of not acceptable housing conditions because they were nervous about losing their housing?
Yes, 100%, including myself, I would say. There's so many students that are talking about different problems that they're experiencing, and there's no housing, and so they have to deal with it. They have to put up with it. Or for a lot of people, it's also just the price. They're just like, if I leave, I'm going to have to pay more because the price I'm paying right now is under the market level, and they just have to deal with it.
And so do students feel as well, like the families, that there's no one to really report these conditions to? Like, is there no support here at the university for those kinds of situations?
I would say that a lot of people just genuinely don't know their rights as renters overall. And I feel like if they were to know their rights, they would definitely report it because it is unjust of what's happening.
You are listening to Stephen McKay, Associate Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the Director of the UC Santa Cruz Center for Labor Studies. He is also the co-principal investigator of No Place Like Home, the affordable housing crisis study here in Santa Cruz County. And you're also listening to Hermes Padilla, an undergraduate student researcher who makes a part of the team for No Place Like Home. Steve, you were very, very committed to ensuring that community groups were part of this process. Could you share with us why that was so important for you?
Well, it makes for better research. We developed this model that we call community-initiated student-engaged research. And the idea behind it really is, we're a public university. The idea is we do research for the public good. And how better to do that than to focus that locally. So for us, who want to know more, I'm a sociologist, so I want to better understand how the world works, and I want to do it as accurately as I can. And so by connecting with community organizations, we do a couple things. First, the community organizations that we're working with, so the California Rural Legal Assistance, and then we've been working with the Community Action Board of Santa Cruz County, and now also Community Bridges. All of those groups serve a lot of the most needy residents of Santa Cruz. And they want to know how to do it better, but they're often strapped, and so they don't have time to do research. And so actually CRLA came to us to say, we're trying to, provide legal services both on workers' issues and housing, but we don't know what is really going on out there. And so that's why we call it community-initiated research. So we get our research puzzle or questions from the community organizations. And the idea is that then we learn something about the community, but the community organizations then could use that to tailor their services or also in their advocacy, because they can then bring that to their funders or to others and better highlight what the conditions really are like.
And Hermes, you get the final question here. You, as someone who's new to the research process, what did you learn about yourself as a researcher, as a person, as a young person in this process, taking on an issue that is so difficult and challenging and really a crisis in every sense of the word?
So what I did learn about myself was definitely about my privilege of being part of this project and being part of academia that is helping to solve this issue. While I was surveying a lot of people in Watsonville, I kept hearing stories about rent burn and how they've had to scrape along in order to live in Santa Cruz. And it just reminded me of a lot of how I've grown up and how I grew up with parents that were renting. And when I heard people speak about their stories, I kept wanting to continue with the project, because I know a lot of people that I spoke to only spoke Spanish, and they pretty much said that they needed me to represent them and to represent their community and what their community actually wants. And because there's no other way, I was kind of the translator for them in that sense. And it actually changed my perspective about how I view academia overall, and it made me really want to continue with community-based research, and it made me understand truly how much my placement in academia matters.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming on to Voces Criticas tonight. It has been a pleasure hearing more about your work.
Thanks, and I hope people will come out to the event next Thursday at the Civic Auditorium. Again, it's a Thursday from 7 p.m., and we'll be revealing more of our research, and you also, lots of community organizations working on the housing issue will also be present.
That's at 307 Church Street, Santa Cruz, next week, 7 p.m. Thanks so much for tuning in.